So I was planning on doing a live stream. That didn't really work. Maybe it'd be better if I just talked about what was going on in my head. That's what vlogging is, after all. I don't know if vlogging is the fashion anymore. It's all about streaming. But it might be good to just let it all fly out. Over the weekend, I had a very interesting weekend. Yeah, I went to the Evacuation Day ceremony in Lower Manhattan. Then I attended the Edison train show, which was a lot of fun, all these model trains. And in the evening, I went to a screening for the Thomas fan film community on YouTube. I think they're wonderful. I really think they're wonderful. And then yesterday, I watched a lot of The Amazing Atheist. He's back. He's back to making videos, which makes a lot of sense. I think what we're seeing now in the 2024 is a nostalgia in so many ways for the politics of the 2000s in both directions. With Trump, and I think this is bigger than him personally, it's more with the DeSantis crew. They want to go back to the Bush years, back to religious conservatism. And they say they're moving beyond neocons, but those aren't who Trump is appointing. I'm going on a lot of different directions here, I realize. So you guys talk about culture and streaming, and I'm talking about, what's going on in the halls of power. One few thing I do know about Andrew Breitbart, the media figure, is he said politics is downstream from culture. So did Pat Buchanan in the 90s. That is where the modern term culture war came from. But it only had one real success. But it was a big success. But that success in 2014 was itself a product of distinct historical conditions, as are all events. That's why ideology doesn't work. That's why history is much more important than ideology, and that is why cultural history is more important than political history. I know I'm going in 50 different directions here, I realize that. But I'm trying to find a common theme in lots of different events. And I think that common theme is the rejection of, I call them canned thoughts, standard narratives. And what are those standard narratives? I want to talk a bit about Evacuation Day, which was when the British Army left New York City in 1783. The British took New York in 1776 from Staten Island to Long Island to Manhattan, to battles throughout Manhattan as the Continental Army retreated into Pennsylvania, and their attack back into New Jersey is what the crossing of the Delaware was. But generally, the historical narrative of the United States comes mainly from the Revolution, and at least from the conservative perspective. And the Revolution is always portrayed much more simplistically than it was historically, and that makes it boring. What do I mean by this? And this is why ideology is limiting. Someone who goes by Lyndon Baines Johnson on Twitter actually states it very well, that the prevailing orthodoxy on American Revolution historiography is neo-Whig. Is, yes, everything was tyranny, and then the American Revolution happened, and then not tyranny. Freedom, yay. And so, therefore, the statements in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, as well as other documents like the Federalist Papers, are sacrosanct. There is a left-wing version of this, which says that Yeah, but it wasn't really true for everybody. Women, native peoples, uh, enslaved peoples, non-whites generally, even those without property, were left out of the revolution. But it is still Whiggish. But what's been happening, I've seen this happen over the past 10 years. I've seen it at the scholarly level. I've seen it at the geeky level. I've seen it on wikis, Wikipedia, and even TV tropes. That the neo-Whig perspective on revolutionary America is just not sustainable. But the left-wing counter to that is not effective. That, oh, yeah, the revolution was good, it just didn't go far enough. It didn't live up to its principles. And so we, as Americans, now have to do that. And I mean, that seems reasonable. Whereas, the right is just, they claim to be hard-headed, serious people. But then when you question sacred narratives, they get all gooey and knock-kneed. They do their version of the screaming at the sky. That's what Christian nationalism, that's what right-wing patriotism fundamentally is. It's deeply anti-intellectual. It's not about questioning our core assumptions. How dare you question core assumptions? We need them, because without them, chaos. And it's poorly articulated, it's poorly structured. But then the left doesn't really seem able to articulate much beyond everything about the conservatives' perspective is true. It's just not implemented, and it was never implemented. That's, even Hamilton doesn't fully accept this premise, because pretty much every artistic work about the revolution assumes it was a birth of human freedom. But what that requires is pure ignorance of Britain in the 17th century, where they had a revolution of their own, 2 of them, and most Americans don't learn about those at all. There are plenty of Americans who don't even know what a parliament is. It's just, there's Elizabeth I, who was cool because Shakespeare, and then I guess King James because of the Bible, and Shakespeare was still alive, and then George III, who was the most evil tyrant ever, and then Winston Churchill, who was the Lord of Democracy. And there's no real attempt to explain that story, and I think doing so is vital for American history, as well as world history, because looking at Britain and America comparatively is helpful for both. And I know plenty of British people. I'm curious to hear their responses to this, which are, what was transatlantic education like? How do British and American education systems differ? I know in Britain you got horrible histories, and that's amazing. We would never have something like that. We have nothing like horrible histories. We still sanctify our history in the United States. And that leads to the general political ideological problem, which is history is still viewed as a source of moral lessons for today, rather than here's what happened in the past, why it happened. They're 2 different perspectives, and neither the right nor the left do the latter. They both do the former. They claim different lessons. And I guess that's useful, but I think it causes more problems than it solves. It's a cycle. And the cycle is, right-wing patriotic history, we're the greatest human beings to ever exist because our institutions are the best institutions ever. And any attempt to question them is like, you're trying to bring about the fall of civilization. And left's like, no, look at all these skeletons! Which is true. The right just paves over the skeletons. They're like, no, we're still the best. Those are just mistakes. Like, come on. When you see the skeletons, the first becomes untenable. But it's just a cycle. Because how dare you say there are skeletons? Ignore the skeletons. Don't worry about it. We're so good. We'll pave over the skeletons. It's fine. But that doesn't actually get rid of the skeletons. And so there's actually another approach to take. Pragmatic realism. Not progressivism, not conservatism. Both are dead ends. Look at history as things people did. Primary sources. And that is what should guide your secondary analysis. Looking trans-institutionally, at least interinstitutionally, internationally. How do the different institutions within a single country work? That's what separation of powers is. Usually, AP US history, it jumps from institution to institution. No wonder people are confused. Because even when those, like, Supreme Court cases, like congressional elections, like presidential elections, like new state formations, AP US history jumps around. But while those classes' focuses are, like, on, say, Supreme Court cases, new states are still being formed. International relations is still happening. Even between 1815 and 1898. But no one really cares too much about that besides the war with Mexico and Spain. I know this is going on in 50 different directions. I'm trying to make a point out of it. What we're talking about, American history, and an Atlantic approach, a neo-Atlantic approach to early American history. What does that mean? That means looking at the British Empire before American independence holistically. The 13 colonies are part of a larger institution, which is the British Empire, even before Britain was formed, even if it was the English Empire. What was going on in the metropole that affected the provinces? We might hear about, how the Duke of York conquered New Netherland from the Dutch. We probably don't learn that Duke of York was James II, who was removed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which had involvement on this continent as well. This is what I mean by neo-Atlantic. It solves a lot of the problems that teachers have in teaching colonial American history. That there's like nothing to grab onto. Yeah, because the interesting things are happening across the ocean. And they affect later history. That is where John Locke came from. That is where Thomas Hobbes came from. They were living through major historical events in Britain. And you need to understand what's going on over there. Yeah, sure, start with Magna Carta. I'd say that's more of a world history focus. But definitely, looking at the 17th century should be transatlantic. That's how you get from Queen Elizabeth and King James to George III. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 is consistently ignored by many Americans, and that's a terrible mistake. Because it just promotes ignorance. Even Mike Duncan, whose podcast, Revolutions, covers the long 19th century very well, and even the English Civil War very well. But I actually asked him, why don't you cover the 1688 revolution? He says it's not important. Mike Duncan is heavily focused on the idea of revolution as systems failure, which is, I think, a great framework. It explains the French Revolution. It explains the Russian Revolution. Those are states that tried to keep absolutism beyond the time that it was tenable. But that leads to confusion. Well, what was the American Revolution about? What was the system that failed? The 1688 system failed. Most Americans don't even know what that is, and that's a terrible shame. That was the compromise. That was where the British constitutional monarchy was fully solidified. And after Queen Anne died and Britain was unified into a single kingdom, Ireland was not until 1801. That's why the flags are that way. Ireland was a separate kingdom, just like England and Scotland were separate kingdoms during the 1600s. It all actually does make sense, and it's not that complicated. There's a saying, maybe I think it's still on Britain's TV Tropes page, that, everything about Britain is made to baffle foreigners. And I just think foreigners, non-Britons, are just arrogant but also because they view Britain as, redcoats stealing their wealth or murdering a bunch of people. But there's more to it than that. Every country views itself as intrinsically righteous. So you need to understand them on their own terms. That's what international relations is. And that includes culture. In my live stream on Saturday, I tried to get around to the point that American exceptionalism is not a tenable idea, because it renders the whole world, but especially Europe and especially Britain, as peoples without history. But then you look at their histories, the British 17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the idea that America was the only democracy in the world, it's the only republic since Rome, the only free society, it's not quite as tenable. And so, basically, Paine was right about a lot of things, but I think he was wrong about the American Revolution. It really was purely about national independence. Sorry. That not to say that, like, the ideas expressed in the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Bill of Rights, they are deeply important. But consider American liberty, republicanism, the American Revolution led to Jacksonian democracy. And you have to square that circle. Meaning, giving freedom to a people enables them to do bad things as well as good ones, not just slavery, but native genocide. There are people who say, oh, settler colonialism is not a valid idea. Settler colonialism is a completely valid idea. It is useful to distinguish between imperialism, where you just come up into a fully existing functional society and subverting that society to your own economic ends through war and economic work, and through getting rid of the people in one place and moving in your own people. Those are separate concepts. What's not a separate concept is post-colonialism, because that's just nationalism elsewhere. Because that's creating a distinction that doesn't really exist. Because, the Germans were oppressed by kings. Well, so was most of Europe. Nationalism was initially a rejection of monarchy. So post-colonialism is just nationalism outside of Europe. Which, okay, that's not invalid. It's just a part of things. I mean, I don't particularly care for nationalism, though, because it's based on ignorance. Because it's just moralism without looking at things truthfully. And in Evacuation Day, I don't know what I was expecting. Because for the past 10 years, I've seen it. I've seen it at France's Tavern. I've seen it among historical academics that I visit. I go to their conferences. And it's clear, both at that level and at the nerd level, that looking at the American Revolution from an interinstitutional perspective, a neo-Atlantic perspective, is what is the new hotness, and it has broad appeal. The ceremony where the Union Jack, which I forget, I think it was the post-1801 Union Jack with the Ireland stripes on it, which would have been anachronistic. Most people, they don't know why. Because Ireland was a separate kingdom in personal union with Great Britain. That's why. Ireland was its own thing. It had its own parliament, but the king of Britain was the king of Ireland. Just like in the 1600s, England and Scotland had the same king but separate parliaments. There! It's not that complicated. It's not a hard idea to understand. But anyway, the ceremony kind of felt more neo-Whig than neo-Atlantic, even though it could clearly go more towards neo-Atlanticism. I think it was because it was like, a bunch of older folks. Like, they wouldn't be party to all these changes, whereas younger people might be. Across the political spectrum. But the artistic establishment, which is more party line left-wing, although they claim to be otherwise, is more just universalist neo-Whig. And that's what actually brings me to my next point, which is looking at the Thomas fandom, which I am a part of, which I've done, I still do voice work for, and I'm proud of it. The same day, the British Army leaves. Good thing, troops are on the ground. But British culture has an appeal here in the United States, at least in the greater New York area, where you grow up reading C.S. Lewis, C.S. Forester, J.R.R. Tolkien, Roald Dahl, Wilbur Awdry. Cultural connections are important. What on this continent well, L. Frank Baum was of Oz. Edgar Allan Poe, Mark Twain. Those names are equally important. And one thing I do remember from Breitbart, and I do agree with him, that, American studies should focus on those names. It's important to focus on bell hooks and Martin Luther King. But I think there is a limit to that, even in the 619 Project, that only one group is America's story. And I think a better way to square that circle is pragmatic realism. That, man, black folks were the fuel of empire. But they were the fuel of empire. Native peoples were the actual target. And I think that's an important distinction to make. And I'm sure they've updated their 619 Project to reflect that. And obviously a lot of more liberal centrist folks no, we need the patriotic narrative to unite people and to inspire liberalism. And I just don't agree. But I see where it's coming from. All right, let me put what I was going to say later aside. Going back to the politics of the 2000s, where even more intensely, the right isn't even pretending to be patriotic anymore. They're not saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're not saying we the people. They're not saying freedom. They're not saying democracy. They're saying Christ is king. Every knee will bow. There are icons of a flag bound to a cross. Man, even Bush and his gang wouldn't go this far. So there's an opportunity. The left can re-pick up patriotism, but it can't be like how the Democratic Party does it. The solution is pragmatic realism. That's it. That's looking at, what everyone's doing. Because that is actually much more moralist. Because the moralist approach is, there are evil people. Okay, why are they evil? Why are they doing the horrible things? The genocide, the slavery, the conquest. You need to look into that. How and why they do what they do. It's pure greed, but it wouldn't be successful if it was just that. They had to build their systems, how their systems work. And you could condemn it, sure. No, that's fine. But just stopping at condemnation just promotes ignorance. And ignorance is the problem. Ignorance is always the problem. That is a target that can be fought. And it's solved with knowledge. Not the feel-good mythology or the desire to burn everything down. That's thesis and antithesis. The synthesis is, what is everyone doing? And now we can get to the Thomas fandom. And I'm sure you guys just want to do your own thing. You want to play with your trains. Hell yeah, man. That's not an isolated thing. It's not just a cocoon. I'm sorry. Because you have to admit and accept that this fandom, perhaps in spite of themselves, maybe inadvertently, has done more, maybe than any other, to actually affect policy change. That trains aren't bad. That trains are actually quite good. That the Bulgies of the world won, the Anti-Rail League. That's GM. That's Ford. That's the automobile industry. Britain still kept its railways, even as they privatized them, even as they were closed down to the Beeching Acts. But in the States, dieselization happened very quickly. And autoization happened after that. It's funny. Ayn Rand, she focused on a railroad because she was writing in the 50s, whereas autoization destroyed a lot of America's rail infrastructure, and the world we are in now is the result of that. And Trump is not going to solve that problem. I was kind of neutral on Biden, but at the beginning of the year, he gave in his State of the Union a clear focus on industrial policy, rail development, infrastructure. That was a message. That was a vision. Whereas Republicans are like, rah, immigrants! Like, that, no. Yeah, I get it. Someone in my town speaks another language. If that's not an argument for, there should be more language training. You know what? You want to do a symbolic SOP? Make English the official language of the United States. Okay, great. You're creating jobs to teach English. Awesome. It's actually solving human problems versus institution worship. I know, I'm jumping around 50 different ways. Railways didn't have to become a partisan issue here in the United States, but it did. And hey, there is a children's media that takes trains seriously. That's why the Thomas fandom exists. Because these aren't just the products of a boardroom, but of someone who actually cared. Cared enough to be weird, to war with his illustrator. And he warred with his illustrator because that illustrator didn't really care about the details, and the kids were curious. This character does not have the same number of wheels. It doesn't have the right buffer beams. Which one is it? And so they'd write to him, and he would change his story. That's what the Railway series is really about. It's not about, cutesy trains. No. Here's how trains work. Let's imagine they're like people. Wait a minute. People are very different from machines. People have different life cycles from machines. People can change much more easily than machines can. And it's mostly young guys, who are into that sort of thing. And they're around. And they make stuff of their own. They use the toys to tell their own stories. And they broadcast them publicly. Not broadcast. Well, the internet is kind of broadcasting, but it's very different from broadcasting. And who's here to speak to those guys? Who probably have very strong opinions about rail policy. Because that's what the Railway series is about. The railways are nationalized. Then the Beeching Acts comes, and lots of branch lines are closed down. And it's a story told in children's books with continuity. And then it's brought to TV, and it's a kids' series with continuity. And that's unique. And so people poo-poo it, like, no, you're making a terrible mistake. And people think trains are kids' stuff, or they're old-fashioned. And no, most of the world try to modernize trains. A kids' media franchise that isn't just about art. Anime fans are about anime. Video game people are about video games. Rail fans are about rail. And rail wasn't built to entertain kids. It was to move stuff around and make money for the people who move the stuff around. Which is fascinating. And there's so much more you can do with it. And it's guys who are interested in this sort of thing. So, if the Dems want to win back young men, rail policy. Why are things the way they are? Why do you have to drive 15 minutes to even get a jug of milk or a carton of eggs? It's that level of deep thinking that Mario Cuomo, I think, gave us an alternative to the Democrats in the 90s that they rejected in favor of Bill Clinton. That's what Bernie Sanders was offering. But the Dems were too enamored, not even of technocratic solutions, because these are technocratic solutions, but Biden was offering them, and Harris was hoping to build on them, and they were rejected. And who's going to speak for these guys? Because Christian nationalists and conservatives, they're not going to do it, because they don't value men as human beings. They value men as ideals. I guess it's good to have ideals, but if an ideal is imposed on you, and you notice the contradictions, you see the skeletons, and you don't want to accept it, then it's not really an ideal, is it? That's the fundamental problem cultural conservatism has. That is why Pat Buchanan failed consistently in his culture war. Why Comstockery from the 1870s failed, even though it gripped our country for a century, from the 1870s till finally dying in the 1970s, and it's still sending its spindles out. And it's not justifiable at all, like American exceptionalism. We're in a global world. People can talk to each other a lot more. More people can find each other, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's often a good thing. But how do we arrange our society around that? And that we come to our next set of my next topic, which is hearing the old guard. Hearing from T.J. Kirk, the amazing atheist. Yeah, when we needed him most, he returned. When Christian nationalism is reaching its full force, well, organized atheism is coming back. It's coming back bigly, and it's resolved all of its contradictions. Because it can now, thanks to the Freedom from Religion Foundation and True Seidel, they're the patriotic ones. We're the patriotic ones, because we know our founding documents. Whereas Christian nationalism wants to make the Bible with no Americans in it. No Americans wrote it. Americans wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. America never had a war over translations of the Bible. Britain did. Most of Christendom did. America didn't. And Christian nationalists don't realize that they're going to create the exact situation that the Enlightenment was responding to. The fools. And let's see how much they burn in the process. And what's going to rise from the ashes. And the amazing atheist is trying to figure out what's going to rise from those ashes by looking at things from the 60s, what they were trying to accomplish. The hippies were right the whole time. Not necessarily in the flower power, but chilling out is a good thing, actually. He doesn't really talk about this. This is kind of more me. Chilling out is a good thing because it is the solution to the problem America faces, which is we built our institutions to fight the Cold War. The Cold War's been over for 30 years. Sure, yeah, Russia is trying to conquer Ukraine. China might try to take Taiwan. But this is a very different situation from the Cold War. And the Cold War wasn't even the simplistic image that a lot of us have. You know, geopolitics trumped ideology. You know, not all of the communist world got along, even within the Warsaw Pact. Like India was democratic but friendly to socialism. France wanted to keep its own empire, so did the Portuguese. Empires existed. The world built by the 1884 partition of Africa from the Berlin Conference was still around and gradually dying. You know, yes, Soviet claims of anti-imperialism, and after all, you know, the Soviets didn't really have a lot of power in the Soviet Union anyway. the right, the West, which is a product of the Cold War, they really were imperialists. They really were. Just as, maybe in a different way from the Soviets, it was more the Berlin model. And obviously, the United States had, white supremacy. Like, this was real hypocrisy. But, of course, the Soviets were even worse hypocrites. And TJ says, we need a new sort of spiritual awakening based on that every individual is a god, which I'm sure religion's like, no! We need that external god to keep people from going crazy! But no, that's what's making people crazy. Because people see that we can build our understanding of the world so much. Material conditions change ideological realities. The material comes first. The ideological comes after. And as I've been saying on this channel my whole time, we need new ideas for the internet age. Not just fighting capitalism versus socialism forever. Refighting the 20th century. But then, conservatives want to bring us back to the 17th century. And they don't realize just how bad that's going to be. It's going to be like the guys who were at war with us 20 years ago! Who you distracted from! Some have forgotten George W. Bush. They forgot the neocons. They pretend they had nothing to do with them. They forget the Patriot Act. It's your baby. Don't blame Obama for it. It started with you. That's why I respect T.J. Kirk so much. He tells it like it is. He realizes, I think Shu kind of does too, but maybe not as effectively. But TJ realizes we moved on from the crimes of the Bush years. We never processed them. No one's been railing against the Patriot Act. No one's been railing against Guantanamo Bay. Oh, right, Ron DeSantis worked there. And while the Democratic Party establishment also wants to rehabilitate George W. Bush, rehabilitate Dick Cheney, what is to be done? What is liberalism to do? What is left to do? On a spiritual level, TJ says, okay, each person is their own God. What does that mean? We have to actually figure out what that means. Because if each individual is their own God, it can't be like the infinite power of the God of the Bible, of the Torah. God, even God, if we are gods, God must be bound just like we are. I think paganism might be a positive route forward, because Satanism, that's what they kind of were trying to do. Both the Church of Satan, who are kind of more spiritualized objectivists, and the Satanic Temple, who are more spiritualized Enlightenment progressives. I think they're on the right track. There needs to be lots of gods. There need to be infinite gods, because God is the product of human imagination. There were lots of different gods, and then they would say, no, there's one invisible one in the sky. But then a lot of others said, no, he's got a son. And then other people said, no, it's just one. But I think making God an invisible abstraction was ultimately a mistake. Because you go to any fan convention, any kind of enthusiast store, what do you see? You see fetishes, and not just in the horny sense, but that too, but also in the this is something I worship. That is the appeal of the anime girl figurine. That's what a waifu is. It's the sacred virgin. It's the same idea, but actually given physical form. TJ doesn't talk about that either because he's not a gamer. But he says, yeah, love is the most powerful force. Which, yeah, okay, great. You've synthesized. I wouldn't go so far as to say he's synthesized. So much as he acknowledges the moral authority of the universal abstract religions. That yes, actually love is a good moral grounding, which a lot of pagans didn't have. But he takes, let's bring back the paganism in the how the religion actually works, in what you actually worship. Because every artwork can be a god. Every piece of writing can be a Bible. And using that as a basis for a kind of universal pantheon might be the solution to the spiritual problems we're facing. I think that's what TJ is trying to get at. Whereas I'm going from a different direction with my Ludism thing, which more focuses on the moral dimension, which is, what's moral? Protection or play. So play being, what does this button do? How does this work? Ooh, let me play around with this, mess around. That is how human beings learn. And the Dems are not really able to fully embrace this because they're fundamentally institutionalists, just like the conservatives are. It's just, whereas the right has their churches, the left has schools, not realizing that those are also kind of problems. They're an equivalent problem. And, oh man, I completely lost me. Oh, right, yeah. So, protection and play. Protection is the spirit of don't you dare play. That's going to kill you. That's going to kill everybody. Protection is the management of humans to ensure they don't blow up the world. But we're in a very different world now. The force of protection, I'd say, would be Comstock, Anthony Comstock, the man of the Comstock law, saying, yeah, sure, we're a free society, yeah, whatever. But we need to control what people see to maintain Christianity. Or more specifically, a moral order. Not realizing that attempt to create moral order is what creates the chaos in the first place. Because people are always going to be trying weird things. And instead of trying to clamp down on them, that's a waste of energy. But I guess it's a good energy sink. And that is where Pat Buchanan's culture war, that's what it was for. That energy that now can't be directed at evil foreign communists. We need to direct at our own weird people, which was always a big thing in the Cold War, but you kind of justify it maybe a little bit, but after? No. Because it's a fundamental contradiction within Reaganite conservatism especially, between the capitalist first and the Christian nationalism first. What happens when they're in conflict? Why did all these preachers, well, they didn't go along with the deregulation of entertainment, of the FCC, that you can make a toyetic TV series, which is actually really cool. It's just it took them a while to figure out how to do it effectively. And that's what geek culture is fundamentally built on. Ironically, it comes from Reagan's deregulation of the FCC. He screwed over his own Christian nationalist allies and didn't even know it. Or maybe he did. No, I don't think he did. I don't think he realized it because he thought, yes, capitalism and Christian nationalism, of course they go together. Not necessarily. And then there's the military state. But people just want to play with their trains. Guys just want to play with their trains. And if elect wants and liberalism want real futures, want to win back young men, tell them. Conservatives just want to conscript you into their wars, conscript you into their culture wars. They won't let you grill. They won't let you enjoy things because you should be in church all the time. You should be earning money all the time. You should be dying in our wars all the time. You should be worshiping the state all the time. What the liberalism and the left can offer young men is freedom, like real actual freedom of the hippie variety. You can be your own man. And you'd think liberalism and the left would just accept that immediately, but they don't. And that is, with the overturning of Roe, feminism is a real enemy to fight. Finally. Christian nationalism is back. Great. We know who the shock troops are. And hopefully they win. But the story of the previous decade has been, just as with the British Empire after 1759, just as with American conservatism in the 90s, and so the left in the 2010s after their big win in 2012, where conservatism seemed defeated, that energy need to be directed somewhere, and it was directed at geek culture, and that is why we're in the situation we're in now. And a lot of people need to apologize just as the right needs to not just ignore, but apologize for George W. Bush. The left and liberalism needs to apologize for declaring geek culture an enemy. Because it's like the olive branch, the rejection of the olive branch petition in early 1776. When the king said, you know what? These guys have shot our troops. They want me personally to take power over Parliament so they can do what they want. That's not what the British Constitution says. Which John Adams at least starts that process. But if you're looking for new art about the Revolutionary period, taking a neo-Atlantic view is both more modern, more honest, more lucrative, respects people. Because Britain is a land is not an evil, not just an evil conqueror. Just like America is not just an evil conqueror, but also a creator of culture. After the Second World War, whereas the British Empire was winding down and being really nasty about it, they were still producing world-class culture. After all, this is where James Bond and the Beatles came from. This is where Thomas the Tank Engine came from. That's a part of that same tradition, and it captures British life more so than those other art forms. This is why children's media matters. This is why both sides seek to control children's media, and why it needs to declare its own independence. I think I tied them all together. Okay, I tied these 3 different strands together. I think that's the video. Peace out.